Well, good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all to tonight's discussion on allowing for climate-related risks when setting long-term financial assumptions. Before I introduce the session, I would just like to say a few words about Robert Hales, who was the founding chair of the working party behind tonight's session, and he died on the 12th of June, aged 67. He chaired the Working Party from its inception back in November 2015 until ill health forced him to stand down in April 2018, but that's this year. But he did show considerable commitment, continued the role even once he'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer back in 2016, and he fitted the meetings of the Working Party in around his chemotherapy and his other appointments. So the Working Party has been very grateful for his support. He brought an inquiring, open mind to all the discussions, to the questions of whether and how resource and environment issues are relevant to our work as actuaries, and what, if anything, we should be doing about them. They clearly benefited very much from his wisdom and guidance, helped them to structure the work and ultimately to deliver the practical guide and the supporting reports which we have seen. My own memories of Robert stem from his time on council. He was elected to council shortly after myself, and indeed we attended the same Buckingham Palace garden party in that role, so that was a good time. And he was always really helpful and courteous in his work there, and was given a President's Award in 2011. So he will be sadly missed. And before I move on to introducing the speakers, I'd just like to say a little bit about why I think that tonight's topic is a really important one for actuaries. Actuaries have a professional duty to consider climate risks. Just as in all our work, the fact that it's uncertain and difficult to quantify that uncertainty doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to address it or that we can ignore it. And the paper which the Working Party has produced covers key reasons why we do need to consider climate risk in section 2. It talks about climate risk as a material financial risk, especially over the time horizons that we normally consider as actuaries. Talks about the professional duty that was highlighted by the IFOA Risk Alert in May 2017, which I'm sure you've all read. But that stated that actuaries should ensure that they understand and are clear in communicating the extent to which they have taken account of climate-related risks in any relevant decisions, calculations, or advice. And the paper also talks about the widespread interest amongst regulators and policymakers, and indeed quotes from Client Earth, an environmental law charity, who note that actuaries who fail to consider and take into account climate risk in their work and advice now face increasing risks of legal liability and regulatory sanctions. But I'm sure you all know that. That's why you're here tonight. So thank you all for coming. Indeed, I should say tonight is a great choice for this event, because today is the 10th anniversary of the groundbreaking 2008 UK Climate Change Act, and it's also 2018 Climate Finance Day in Paris. So we are in good company, I think. So I would now like to introduce the first set of presentations that we have this evening. We've got a series of short presentations from all the panel that I have here. We have time for a small amount of sort of question for clarification as we go along. Then we will be breaking into discussions to think about how we take all this work forward and what support you as actuaries would like from the IFOA and the Working Party. So let me introduce the first session this evening. It's around climate change for DB pensions actuaries, the implications for financial assumptions. And this is being given by Nick Spencer, Claire Jones, and Andrew Claringbold. Nick is an actuary and a sustainable investment strategist focused on integrating long-term environment, societal and governance influences into investment strategies and portfolios. And before creating his own sustainable advisory boutique, Gordian Advice, Nick was the EMEA lead on responsible investing for Russell Investments, and he's a member of the IFOA Resource and Environment Board. He'll be the first speaker and explain why actuaries should be taking action on climate change. And the second speaker will be Claire Jones, who will outline the Working Party's suggestions for actions that DB pensions actuaries can take to allow for climate change. Claire started her career as a pensions actuary, first in the Big Four and then as a partner at LCP. She took time out to study for an MSc in sustainability before returning to LCP, where she's now head of responsible investment. She's a member of the Resource and Environment Board and chairs the Research and CPD subcommittee. And then the final speaker from this set will be Andrew, who will take us through a case study. He's a pensions actuary at Aon. In addition to giving scheme actuary advice, Andrew chairs the technical guidance group within Aon, which advises actuaries on actuarial valuations and is a member of the Responsible Investment Group. As part of that, he has helped produce deterministic scenarios to be used to show the impact of resource and environment issues on pension schemes. So, Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Colin. Alligators basking off the English coast, a vast Brazilian desert, the mythical lost cities of Saigon, New Orleans, Venice, and Mumbai, and 90% of humanity vanished. Welcome to a world warmed by 4 degrees C. So started a 2009 New Scientist article based on the then latest science from a Met Office conference. Why quote this article? Well, 4 degrees is often used in scenario projections, and it's the current trajectory suggested by many sources, including the US government. And yet I quote a 2009 article, as most of the sources I can find come from that 2009 conference and a follow-on in 2011, albeit the science since then has generally suggested larger, not smaller impacts. Understanding the real-world impacts is important for scenario modelling. Otherwise, there's a potential disconnect if economic influences are merely extrapolated. So I encourage all actuaries to look into the climate science to get a broad sense of the implied reality. What is implied by, say, peak emissions in 2020, or by projecting that 4-degree warming? 4 degrees warmer is more than the Pliocene, 3 million years ago, when the northern hemisphere was free of glaciers and seas were 25 meters higher than they are today. That 2009 science predicted for a 4-degree warmer world included summers in the south of England regularly reaching 45 degrees C, akin to today's Marrakesh, desertification of Europe south of the Alps, so that's making the south of France, Spain, and Italy as uninhabitable as the Sahara is today. That uninhabitable desertification also applied to the Middle East, the south of the US, and almost all of Africa. 85% of the Amazon is gone. Ocean acidification leads to a collapse in the fishing stocks. Sea levels, well, conservative estimates might have 2 meters rises in the next century, with long-run estimates between 9 and 14 meters or more. And I haven't even touched on the impact of agriculture, which is likely to be significant at 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming. Now, I'm not a climate scientist. I can't vouch for this work. These predictions may not come to pass or may represent worlds of 5, 6, 7, or 8 degrees warmer. But I am struck by the disconnect between economic modelling and the impact on civilization that even modest versions of these projections can suggest. As a profession, we should become better aware of these potential physical impacts to ensure realism in our projections, or to better highlight the transition imperative of an inevitable policy response. And so to our paper, and why actuaries should consider climate change. Section 2 of our supplementary report covers the rationale for actuaries to consider climate change, split between a material financial risk, professional duty, and a widespread interest. Given the physical impact of 4 degrees warming, climate change could clearly be a material financial risk. Following on from work by the PRA, material financial risk is typically divided between physical risks, the impacts due to those higher temperatures, transition risks, the economic impact from a transition to a low-carbon economy, and liability risks. And here, these are referring to legal liability risks rather than the actuarial sense of payments due. The risks here refer to uncertainty, which can be positive or negative, although outside the positive impact on low-carbon businesses in the transition, most of these risks are likely to be negative. In section 3 of our report, we outline some of the research from Mercer, CISL, and Aon in quantifying the risk impacts, noting though their focus on assets and their limitations in regards to modelling future inflation and interest rate risks. As an example of the asset impact, CSISL unhedgeable risk quotes an extreme but plausible outcome of 50% equity market falls that could happen at any moment. The importance of professional duty has been covered by Colin. Bottom line, actuaries have a duty to consider material risks, notwithstanding the uncertainty of those risks. And there's widespread interest. Now, I could spend 2 hours just outlining 2018 reports from regulators and NGOs. But as a snapshot, 2018 has seen updates and reports from the Prudential Regulatory Authority, PRA, Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, Department of Work and Pensions, DWP, the Pensions Regulators, TPR, and Environmental Audit Committee, EAC. Pat and David will cover a little more details on the FCA and PRA in their presentations. And finally, this is not just the UK, or just a long series of acronyms, but includes Europe and global regulators too. Understanding climate risk is now explicitly mentioned in IOPS, the Institutions for Occupational Retirement Provisions Directive, Solvency II, as well as by the International Association of Insurance Supervisors, the IAIS, which represents insurance supervisors globally. So having opened with a snapshot onto the whys, I'll now hand to Claire on what actuaries should be doing.
Hey, so how should actuaries be allowing for climate change when setting long-term financial assumptions? I find that people tend to assume that our working party is advocating that you make an explicit adjustment to your assumptions of X basis points per annum, but we're not. We think that would usually be inappropriate due to the high levels of uncertainty and the difficulty in quantifying climate impacts. For the same reason, we're not advocating that you recalibrate your stochastic models. What we are doing is encouraging you to use scenario analysis to explore alternative futures. We all know that the past is not necessarily a good guide to the future, so how might the future be different? Now, we're in good company in suggesting that you use scenario analysis because that's also suggested by the high-profile task force on climate-related financial disclosures. And the work of that task force is catalysing new research and activity, which is developing materials that will be useful for us in actuaries in applying scenario analysis. What is it we're trying to achieve with these scenarios? Well, first and foremost, it's about helping our understanding and our clients' understandings of how climate risk might impact us. Then that can inform decisions as to whether to act, and if so, where and how to act. The sort of actions that a pension scheme might take include the ones I've shown there. I think the most likely action is for them to review their investments to look for ways in which they can reduce exposure to climate risk. But they might also try and find some key performance indicators that the trustees can use to keep an eye on the sponsoring employer's exposure to climate risks. Most relevantly for tonight, it can inform the level of prudence that trustees adopt. It could affect the level of technical provisions they set or the length of the recovery plan. That might be because the trustees, having studied the scenarios, conclude that their scheme is particularly exposed to climate risk. Or it might simply be that they feel a bit more cautious once they understand the extra uncertainties that climate change brings. So how might you go about developing and using scenario analysis? Well, as you'd expect, lots of climate scenarios have been developed already. And the ones that are most commonly used are the ones by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the International Energy Agency. But what our working party found was that these aren't terribly useful for actuaries. They're high level, they're focused on climate policy and the energy system, and they don't really look at financial impacts. That means that we as actuaries might well need to develop our own scenarios. We anticipate that that would normally be done centrally by actuarial firms rather than by individuals. But if you are developing scenarios, then take a look at the appendix to our report. There's a lot of work going on at the moment which is starting to develop more granular scenarios, ones that are more focused on corporate impacts, which is useful if you're trying to think about the impact on the sponsoring employer, or to look at the impacts on individual companies within an equity or corporate bond portfolio. But what that doesn't help us with is understanding the macroeconomic impacts, like the potential effect on interest rates and inflation. And we found that very few people have been starting to think about that. The only work we're aware of at the moment in the pension space is work that's being done by Aon, Mercer, and Ortec Finance. And I'm pleased we've got people here from all three organisations tonight, and Andrew will shortly tell you about some of Aon's work. But first, I want to give you some tips for climate scenario analysis. You don't just need a climate scenario, you need several of them. You need to consider both physical risks and transition risks. So that means at least one high temperature scenario with lots of physical risk, and at least one lower temperature scenario with lots of transition risk. Quantification is really hard, so don't get too hung up on the numbers. Focus instead on the narratives and use that to build your understanding of potential climate impacts. Because climate impacts will play out over many decades, you might need a longer time horizon than you usually use for scenario analysis. But don't forget that there can be short-term impacts as well, particularly as market expectations change. So think about some scenarios with short-term shocks as well as longer-term trends. Make sure that you cover all relevant aspects. So thinking about the financial and covenant impacts, but also the demographic ones like mortality. And last but not least, because any kind of quantification that you do produce will inevitably be uncertain, make sure that you understand and clearly communicate the limitations of what you do. I'm going to pass over to Andrew to talk about Aon's work.
Thanks, Claire. So I'm going to summarise how we've used the Aon scenarios for one client and how clients have responded in general. So more details on the client particulars are in our paper, so I'm going to skip past all these and instead focus on the results. On this graph, you should be able to see our projections of the funding levels on a self-sufficiency basis. We assume the investment strategy does not change for this purpose, although in practice the scheme will de-risk when it gets to full funding, which in this case is expected to be within 10 years. We've projected 4 climate change scenarios and a base scenario over 10 years, and we've compared it to a stochastic funnel up there. There are 2 scenarios where climate change action is taken immediately. Under the green skies scenario, regulations are introduced, new technologies are taken up, and the changes are incorporated with little disruption to either economic growth and with little impact on gilt yields. Under the green regulation scenario, which is down there, the regulations are introduced, but there is some disruption to economic growth with all the transitional changes. Also, gilt yields rise as the government is forced to borrow more to finance investment in renewable energy. Markets react immediately to transitional disruption, and the funding level falls by around 10% in this example. However, the funding level does get back on track after 10 years as a beneficial impact of the changes eventually come through. The no mitigation scenario, which is the red line, also shows little impact over 10 years. There are no transitional changes to disrupt the economy, and the physical impacts are not yet sufficiently obvious. In fact, over 10 years, the biggest impact is actually from the forced green scenario, it's this one here, where the evidence of climate change becomes so significant after 5 years that urgent action is needed to be taken. And it's the theme of these scenarios that the later the action is taken, the more drastic it has to be, and the more the market will react with equities falling. And in this scenario, gilt yields fall as well in reaction to the less promising economic outlook. The funding is therefore behind after 10 years, and the scheme has not reached its full funding. About over 20 years, well, the good news is that the forced green scenario, the scheme does actually get back up to 100% after 20 years, but the nightmare scenario here is the no mitigation one. Where it's become so obvious now that action has to be taken, and very drastic action has to be taken. And in fact, it's probably too late, and you've left with permanent damage to the economy, and it falls off and never gets back on track. So what does this mean for the clients? We've done it so far. Well, perhaps the first thing to say is the clients we've done it on so far have been those who've bought into this, and actually they found this analysis very useful to sort of back up why they should be doing something. It'd be a lot more difficult with sceptical clients. But what action has been taken? Well, the main one, as Claire said, was investment strategy, and there's a lot of action you can take in this space, and that's beyond the scope of my talk today. Covenant, in my case, which this one here, the company was already taking actions and had a target to being carbon neutral, but there will be a lot of companies out there whose covenant, when you talk about narratives, the companies may well suffer, and can the companies afford the contributions in those scenarios? It brings into sharper focus the time horizon. The scheme is hoping to get full funding in 10 years. Well, if you don't get there within 10 years, you soon start getting into the nightmare scenarios. And so it reaffirms the importance of getting there, and which leads you into the contingency planning at the end. How would you identify the warning signs that you're not going to get there within 10 years? How would you identify that climate change risks are emerging? And how would you react before it was too late? Very much in the pensions regulator speak, integrated risk management. Now, there's a lot more I could say, but in the interests of time, I'm now going to open the floor up to questions.
Okay, thank you very much to all of you. We do have a couple of minutes if there are any immediate questions on what we have heard so far. And I think we have a microphone, so if you could wait for that. Anyone to ask a question of our first three speakers? Yes, please. There's a microphone.
Thank you. Ian Sim from Impacts Asset Management. There's a sense in the scenario analysis that's being used at the moment that the variables are all exogenous, but I wonder whether you could comment about the potential for feeding back into the policy circles the idea that more clarification around carbon pricing could take the exogeneity out of the variable.
Yes, Ian, I think you raised a good point. I mean, the general work here is something that the sort of institute's been doing. In fact, I know sort of represents Cruz Faye Alessandro, very much interested and quoted. The actuaries were quoted, I think, this week or last week in the House of Lords as part of the response. But you're entirely right. I think one of the exercise here is not only to get the scenario planning, but to actually understand what the physical and the sort of climate impacts are and be able to relate that back into the areas and also feed that into policy space. So most definitely, but yes, that's important to help the public understanding of what these risks imply.
Thank you. Any other questions for our first three speakers? No, in which case, thank you all very much. Obviously, we've focused on the pensions area to start with, but we're now going to hear some thoughts on the implications of climate change for financial assumptions in other practice areas, and that will be presented by the chairs of the 3 working parties who are developing practical guides to climate change. So that's Patrick Race on investment, David Ford on life insurance, and Mark Rothwell on general insurance. Just to give you a brief introduction to them, Patrick is a partner in KPMG's investment advisory business in the UK. He provides the full range of investment consulting advice to clients and joined KPMG in July 2017, having previously worked for Mercer since 1996. And he leads KPMG's ESG investment research team. David has spent most of his life working for life insurers, originally in the UK, but now also internationally. His current role involves supporting business units across the globe with optimizing and enhancing profitability from in-force life insurance portfolios. So his interest in climate change effects on life insurance therefore stems from the need to understand the risk profiles and the capital requirements of those portfolios. Mark is a general insurance actuary and is head of investment and solvency risk for Direct Line. And he's a member of the Resource and Environment Practice Board, and as I've already heard, chairs the working party in general insurance. So Patrick, if I could ask you to start.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction. Just to follow on with the sort of introductory comments. So we're representing the 3 working groups set up by the Resource and Environment Board to write practical guides. Davey's going to talk a little bit about life insurance later, and then Mark on general. But I'll start first with the investment piece. And the idea of these guides, they are guides rather than guidance. So the plan is that it really just helps actuaries deal with climate change related issues across all the work that they do. So starting off with investments. Investments obviously underlines pretty much or underpins pretty much everything that we do as actuaries. So moving on from risks and returns associated with different assets into drivers of financial and demographic assumptions, and then into the sort of pricing and reserving work that all underlines everything really. My working group, the investment working group, is the more recently set up. So I don't have results to present to you today. We're planning on reporting back in the first quarter of next year, and then we're hoping to take the work forward into sort of a deeper analysis of the more interesting areas. And I've been working with a few members of the finance and investment boards to make sure that what we do is joined up, and also to try and internationalize some of the features, because clearly what we're looking at is not a UK specific question at all. So in terms of the content, we've followed the actuarial control cycle as a structure, which is shown here on the slide, designed really to get the thinking moving, and it's certainly generated an awful lot of good discussions in the working group so far. We've got more meetings coming up, and key considerations really for setting financial assumptions. So that's the structure of what we're doing. We're in terms of the themes, we're really focusing on 4 parts, as shown here. So we're going to be looking at the regulation and the science, moving into risks and opportunities, and then the key areas, summary of what actuaries can do in order to do their work better, just to manage their clients' expectations more succinctly. Now, we'll be drawing on a mine of regulation and scientific research, as illustrated with the pictures here. Some of it feels quite old, such as the original UN PRI work, which has clearly evolved over the years, but now that feels like the start of a lot of the work that's carrying on now. Into something that's much more recent, for example, the DWP's new rules on ESG disclosure for pension scheme trustees, which is just through its discussion period and very much into in the mainstream as far as the work I'm doing is concerned. We're also looking at the FCA's latest consultation paper on climate change and dealing with green finance, which is suggesting a wide range of disclosures for financial services firms and how they manage and plan their climate change related risks. So thinking about the content, we will be looking at risk first, and just to give you a stat on risk that one of my group came up with in the drafting process. So this is from the World Economic Forum 2018 and their paper on climate change, and that's looking at 8 out of 10 of the highest likelihood and biggest impact risks are linked to climate change. And so the risks are very much in the mainstream and also extremely material. So to quote another source, this is the Economist Intelligence Unit, which placed a value at risk of $4.2 trillion on climate-related risks. Now, that's by the end of the century at the 95% level for the actuaries in the room, which I suspect there are many. That rises to 43 trillion with a smaller probability attached. So extremely material risks that we do have to take account of. And our working group is going to be looking at how we sort of convert those stats and some of the other things we're uncovering into guidance for actuary or guides for the population. As well as looking at risk, there is an intention to move on to return, and that's a particular area that I've been focusing on with my client work, which we can perhaps discuss in Q&A. There are clearly diverse opportunities that are thrown up by a world as it moves into to manage their climate risks. So just give you an example there, looking at the 2016 Global Climate 500 Index, who surveyed their population. Positively, they were looking at around about half of that constituents looking at climate-related risks, so not a bad result. However, if you move into thinking about what asset owners are doing, and asset owners, we've only got around about 25% of asset owners actually taking into account climate-related risks in, setting their investment strategy and monitoring the performance. So far fewer than really will be needed as we move into a much more integrated world looking at climate change. Our plan is to take up on what Claire's been talking about with the economic scenarios and help the profession put together a range of different economic scenarios and things that they can use with their clients and guidance on how they can be used to set asset allocation. That will be the primary goal of what we're doing with our working paper. The plan is to take that in towards asset managers, which is obviously an area of an awful lot of interest for the clients that I'm dealing with at the moment, and helping them to think about the climate-related risks and how they apply to different different sectors, and all the smaller sub-classifications of investments that they could be looking at. So going as deep as we possibly can. There will be a plan for next year to move full circle and look at asset owners and potentially integrate the work that we're doing with asset managers into how the assets themselves are managed and how companies manage their climate-related risks and engage with shareholders and other stakeholders in the business. So that's the idea of circling it all the way around back to the assets themselves. So, as I say, this is very much work in progress and very broad topic to cover. I'm going to hand over to David, who's going to talk a little bit more on the life side, and then we can take questions on the three later on.
Thank you, Patrick, and good evening, everybody. So we've heard in the initial section and from Patrick some general considerations for setting financial assumptions. What I'm looking to do now is give some specific considerations which might be appropriate for life insurance aspects. And in order to do that, and maybe echoing Claire's comments, we're not expecting at this stage to be able to come up with specific sets of explicit assumptions that you'd be using to adjust your models. But what we're trying to do is think about classifications and ways of addressing some of those initial approaches. So in this slide, I brought out two high-level aspects of that. Firstly, in considering the level of exposure a firm might have to climate change, we can start to think about the broad blocks of business that it transacts. And in this schematic, what I've looked to do is through those broad blocks of business, make those distinctions between those with long duration and a high investment component, and those with much shorter duration and a lower investment component. And in this, I'm drawing out the distinction, for example, between the traditional savings and annuity products, where there's also an element of guarantee there, which is therefore exposed from a shareholder point of view to material financial changes, to those of unit-linked savings, where again, there could be a significant volatility in asset value, but there's maybe an element of sharing that with policyholders. The one point I would bring out here, of course, though, is that in looking at this, this is specifically a classification in relation to the degree of exposure to long-term financial assumptions. Climate change can and will affect policies and the exposure of a life office through not just financial assumptions, but also through aspects like demographic change. So those product types like traditional guaranteed risk or reviewable risk products are still potentially at risk from climate-related events, just not necessarily financial assumptions so greatly. And then the point I'm making at the bottom is that often, and if we think about things like solvency and capital modelling, life insurers will often be using risk-neutral financial assumptions with stress test-based assessment. So again, with that underlying assumption potentially of risk-neutral assumptions throughout, one of the aspects we might then be considering and wanting to understand is the degree of volatility or exposure under particular combinations of events to changes in those asset values. So that's maybe given two initial ways of starting to think about the classification. In this slide, I'm giving a further sort of conceptual breakdown of the stages of maturity a life insurer, hopefully guided by its actuaries, will be working through. And again, to echo Claire's initial comments, she pointed out that we're unlikely at this stage to be considering detailed, explicit changes to financial assumptions, but what we can do, what we would recommend, is consider scenario testing with multiple scenarios just to understand how climate change could affect businesses. And therefore, in looking through these three stages, we'd encourage firms to think about a general awareness and identification of climate change risk. And two aspects there to be aware of might be, is the firm building an awareness or identification of climate change risk into its governance arrangements? Does that fit within its risk framework and the risk tools there? Then we'll be in a position to start thinking about scenario testing, maybe extreme scenarios with high physical or high transitional risk. And that scenario work can help get an understanding of where the key vulnerabilities or the key exposures are for a business in terms of its longer-term strategic or business planning. Moving further into the future, perhaps, tools like the ORSA, or the Own Risk and Solvency Assessment, could be documentation which is a way of capturing and formalising the company's views on that sort of exposure. And then finally, we'd be at the stage of maturity of being able to make quantitative adjustments to capital models and pricing. Those are the sort of considerations we're looking at. One further point I'd like to draw out there as well is that this kind of evolution of thinking and some of the steps that are being picked up here are also reflected in the latest PRA consultation, which is a draft supervisory statement on banks' and insurers' approaches to climate change risk. I won't read out in a great deal of detail here what the recommendations are, but what I would recommend is that those involved in life or general insurance do take the opportunity to read the paper, understand, and as appropriate, look to respond to the consultation by the 15th of January. Now, as I say, that relates to both life and general insurers, at which stage I'll hand over to Mark to draw out some other considerations in relation to general insurance.
Thank you, David. It's tempting within general insurance to focus on the shorter term physical risks. We largely write annually renewable contracts. And in terms of those physical risks, we tend to think about the acute risks. So, for example, that might be floods. So that could include the river and surface water flood risks arising from heavier rainfall. So, for example, the catastrophe modelling company AIR recently discussed the increased capacity of hurricanes to carry more water and the slower progression of hurricane tracks. Or it could be the coastal flooding risks that increase with rising sea levels. The PRA recently quoted expected sea level rises of 21 to 28 centimetres in the case of a 2-degree warming scenario by 2080. We could include it in their storms. Here, London market insurers may think about hurricanes and typhoons, whilst the UK company market might think about the extratropical storms that might typically hit the UK. It could include wildfires. We think about the recent events in California and Greece. It could include droughts and periods of extended hot weather and the impact on crop insurance, etc. The AA recently commented on the impact on breakdown cover from the long period of hot, dry weather we had this summer. However, there are other risks that we need to consider. So transition risks might include those that arise from regulatory or legal change, in particular from the drive to decarbonise the economy. They might arise from technology change. For example, what product liability or fire risks arise from new batteries to power electric cars? It might include change in demand. The new electric cars themselves are an example there. And it might include reputational risks. We also have the potential for liability risks, and we can think of those in terms of a failure to mitigate for climate change. So if our insureds are held liable for carbon emissions, for example. Or it could be a failure to adapt. If our insureds have failed to allow for climate change in their planning, their recommendations or their decision-making. Or it could include a failure to disclose, if insured parties have not sufficiently disclosed information relevant to climate change, or have done so in a manner that's misleading. We also need to think in terms of the longer term. So whilst we look at the physical risks, we might struggle to identify the long-term trend in the physical risks. We're often looking at low frequency and high severity events. And the degree to which we can attribute individual events to climate change is often unclear. The trends we're looking for are then often non-linear. So although we're often looking at annually renewable contracts, we're often not clear where the next annual contract sits on that trend line. We then have other longer-tailed risks, including reserving risks and the associated investment risks. And we have some key strategic risks. Our investors will want to know how we're positioning ourselves for the risks and opportunities that rise from climate change. Are we prepared for what happens as we stop burning petrol? Are we invested in sustainable investments? Do we understand the risks from new battery technology or from new shipping routes through the Arctic? And the range of possible outcomes is broad. I know there are some in the room that will recognise this graph. Like Andrew's graphs, it includes some projections. The y-axis shows CO2 in the atmosphere, and a range of possible projections as to where we could be heading. At the most extreme end, if I use my sonic screwdriver, at the most extreme end, we're looking at a world that could be up to 6 degrees warmer. Warmer even than the apocalyptic world that Nick portrayed. And there, in a world like that, we'll see lots of physical risk. Alternatively, we could end up down the bottom here. We could achieve the Paris goals and have a world that's only 2 degrees warmer. I say only, yeah. But that's going to require a lot of these trend lines to turn very quickly and bring with it lots of transition risks. And certainly we saw on some of Andrew's graphs the way in which the sooner we deal with it, the sooner we start to see those transition risks. And we saw that the longer-term risks that started to emerge here with no mitigation, took longer to emerge, but were more serious still. Carbon Tracker published this graph recently showing their projections for both fossil fuel and renewable energy. And what we can see here is fossil fuels peaking within the next 10 years, and then 20 years of rapid change as we switch from one to another. So it's going to be important to look that little bit beyond the planning horizon and look at the next 10, 20 years when looking at the climate change risks. And certainly that came out in the PRA's consultation paper when they're talking about looking beyond the planning horizon. More information on this will be in the practical guides as they get published. I know that Life and the general ones are getting closer, and investments it's on its way. Can I invite any questions for David, Pat, and myself?
Yes, so thank you all very much. Clearly a lot going on, but also a lot still to think about, and we look forward to reading those guides when they come out. We are rather short of time now, but can I ask if there are any immediate questions for any of our second set of speakers? Yes, there's one from Louise.
I'm Louise Pryor. Just a quick question. I don't know which one for. Do you have any feel whether the scenarios are likely to be different in different countries? How much sort of individual domestic policies in each country will change? I suspect this is more transition risk than physical risk.
Yeah. Just that?
Yes. I think, Louise, it could well depend on the country and the level of significance that you're going to attribute to those. Not least, I mean, you've mentioned transition risk, but equally physical risks could be more extreme in some countries than others, depending, for example, on levels of population within low-lying areas. So I think you would need to factor that in.
Yeah. I think it's quite clear in some of the physical risks that they're not uniform across different geographies. There are clear examples of differences. One example I saw fairly recently was a graph showing the average annual loss from hurricanes in the Caribbean basin, and it had projections with and without climate change taken into account. And for almost every country there, the risk with climate change taken into account was considerably higher. Yeah. But noticeable in going the opposite direction was Mexico, where with climate change it seemed to decrease. Now, there's so many different ways those projections could be right or wrong, but it's certainly sort of a stark reminder that those differences do exist.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, in which case, thank you all very much. And I'd like now to move on to the last of our talks this evening. So we're now able to hear sort of an external perspective on modelling the financial impact of climate change. And I have the pleasure of introducing Vicky Bakshi, who's going to talk about the recent IIGCC report, which she authored on navigating scenario analysis, a framework for institutional investors. Vicky is a responsible investment specialist at BMO Global Asset Management, and she's part of a team of 15, and her focus is on advising the firm on climate change and impact investing. So, Vicky, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here, and it's always tricky to come last. But I am going to give a somewhat different perspective on this question from some of the other speakers, I hope. So I'm going to give you an institutional investor's perspective from the point of view of work I've been doing with the Institutional Investors Group on climate change, and give you a snapshot of, in the asset owner and asset manager world, where we are now in thinking about scenario analysis and where things are going next. And I'm speaking on behalf of the Institutional Investors Group on climate change, which just published this report last week. It's freely downloadable from the website. The IIGCC is a member organisation. It's got about 150 members throughout Europe, representing over 20 trillion euro in assets. It's got some of the UK's largest pension schemes, the likes of USS, BTPS, as members. And it works on public policy on climate change, corporate engagement, and also investor practices. So the members working with each other to figure out how to incorporate climate risks and opportunities into their investment practices. And after the publication of the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which came out in June of last year, the IIGCC set up a work programme specifically aimed at taking those recommendations and helping members to implement them. One of the most challenging recommendations, both from asset managers and asset owners, was the recommendation of the task force that we should think about doing scenario analysis on our investments. And I think that was very much accepted for all the reasons that the speakers so far have been speaking about as a good idea, that we know that there are changes coming. We don't know which direction they're going to go in, but we know they're going to have some impact on our investments, and we need to be really thinking forward about that. The challenge is how to do that. And I think in the institutional investor world, we've been bombarded with ideas and methodologies, and we really wanted to take a step back from that and give some practical guidance to investors on how to think through this question. So the report was based on a working group that was put together at the beginning of 2018. I know a couple of contributors to that report are in this room. It was co-chaired between BMO, myself, and AP2, the Swedish pension fund. Contributors included the likes of Ortec, that's been mentioned today, Impacts, and then some of the Dutch investors like APG, PGGM. We had a couple of insurance-owned managers there too. Allianz and AXA were contributing to that report. And as I said, what we're trying to do is give this practical guidance. And as we started having those discussions in the working group, it very quickly became apparent we needed to step back from the detail and get some clarity about the fundamentals. Because where we are now in the industry is a phase of piloting. There's a lot of work going on. We mentioned maybe only 25% have put reporting out, but there's a lot more activity behind the scenes of institutions thinking about different ways to approach this question. So there's lots of innovation, but also what we heard, even from the sort of very large institutions that were in that working group, is that there's also potential for being overwhelmed, for there being too much going on, and for finding it very difficult to sift through that work and figure out, well, what is the right approach to scenario analysis for me as a financial institution? So the idea of this report is not to set out one approach or say what the right approach is. Indeed, one of the main messages of the report is there isn't a right approach to scenario analysis because it really depends what you're trying to achieve and what your objectives are. The report is about helping to sort of classify and almost a taxonomy of what the available options are for scenario analysis, and to give plenty of case studies, so examples of what investors have actually been doing, how they found that, and probably the most important of all, and I think this has been touched on already, the benefits and limitations of different approaches. And one of the key things is there's no one methodology that can answer all the questions in one methodology. You really have to think what you're trying to achieve and what can help you to achieve that. This is really small and fuzzy and really unhelpful. And I did mean to get this redrawn, but the report's out so recently we haven't managed to. So I will tell you what's in it, but it is in the report. The key message here, the bit at the bottom, if you could possibly read it, says disclosure. And disclosure is what's driving a lot of that action and activity that I talked about going on amongst asset owners and asset managers. We've got over 100 who've formally supported the TCFD recommendations. We've got all the pressures on us that have been mentioned from regulators telling us to do more. So disclosure has been the thing that's driven action. But what we just talked about in the working group is that the value is not in the number you get at the end of scenario analysis. The value really is in the thinking, the thought process you go to in order to get there, to get to that point of having something that you might disclose. And what that actually says is to start, there has to be some kind of structured thinking about this if you're going to get to a useful, actionable result. And the report itself goes through at the top there, that's about setting objectives. So what is scenario analysis trying to achieve? Then, and we've touched on this a little bit already, understanding the scenarios themselves. There are very big differences between scenarios. Then that kind of circly thing, washing machine thing there, is understanding how scenarios can be applied to investments. So it's finding a methodology that works, that you try out, reviewing the results, thinking about what actions to take, and then going back, because this is an iterative process. It's about learning as you go along, and only then getting to thinking about the disclosure part. So it's a big report, but I'm going to touch on some of the key messages in those sort of sections that I mentioned just now. So establishing objectives. I won't go through all the words on here, but this is sort of crucial. This is, again, where the industry needs advice on how do you think through what you're trying to achieve. If you look at the TCFD report, there's a strong focus on governance. It's about the board of, whether it be an asset owner, really sort of thinking through, well, what are we trying to achieve, and what's our sort of board level thinking about our investment beliefs and our objectives in relation to climate change risks and opportunities. And what I say here, there's an interesting discussion we had in the working group here. So clearly the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures and all the stuff that's coming out from regulators, from central banks, is about fiduciary duty, it's about risk, it's about opportunity as well, of course. And here, there's some examples here in these objectives of the kind of objectives you might have if you're really trying to tease out that risk and opportunity, whether that be right at the top level, the kind of liability issues we've been hearing about, or right down in the weeds looking at an individual company if you're doing fundamental stock analysis. But the bottom line here I did want to highlight as well, because there are some pension funds, not just in the UK but also in Europe, who are kind of going a step further than that. They're saying, well, yes, I want to understand the impact that climate change has on my portfolio, but I also want to understand the impact that my portfolio has on the climate. It's the opposite perspective on things. And we're getting more and more institutions saying, I've had an investment belief here that I want to align my portfolio with a 2-degree future. So that's really taking a values-based approach. And it's saying that, that as an institution, they want to actively support the shift to a low-carbon global economy. And that is a slightly different perspective on things. And we highlight that in the report because actually, whether you take a financial risk perspective or whether you take the perspective of, I want to support the transition, they lead you to somewhat different methods of analysis, and that's something we tease out more in the report itself. Alongside these kind of high-level objectives, there are also organisational objectives we talk about in the report. So some of those might be internal communications. They might be about stakeholder engagement. So these are also objectives of doing scenario analysis. And one thing we stress in the report is that this shouldn't all just be about teams like my team as an ESG team. This should have the involvement of investment teams, it should have the involvement of risk teams, it should have board oversight. This is really about a process that eventually should be aimed at mainstreaming this type of thinking, not producing a standalone piece of research. So that's establishing objectives. Then understanding and selecting scenarios. Again, not really time to go into detail here. We very much agree with the kind of messages that have come out so far that, yes, you need to use multiple scenarios and think these through. But using these scenarios, like the IEA, the IPCC scenarios that have been mentioned, do have challenges. And there are 2 challenges we talk about in the report. The first is that scenarios that kind of superficially look the same actually might have quite wildly different assumptions underlying them. And if you don't notice that and you don't understand that, your scenario analysis may point you in the wrong direction. So to give a specific example, if you think about the kind of this different scenarios that map out the future of the energy system in a 2-degree world. So they take 2 degrees, say, right, that's a constraint, that puts a lid on how much we can have in terms of emissions. What does the energy system have to look like in order to get there? Now, some of those scenarios make pretty heroic assumptions about the use of technologies such as carbon capture and storage, which is where you take the emissions of a power station, you capture them, and you somehow trap that, bury it underground, whatever. Other scenarios don't, such as the scenarios produced by bodies like Greenpeace, say, actually, that technology, not really viable, we'll assume that that can't happen. Now, those are 2-degree scenarios. They look the same, but if you're trying to do analysis on the utility sector and what's the future for coal, what's the future for coal miners, what's the future for coal-fired utilities, you will get vastly different results in those two scenarios. So our report talks about the importance of understanding the key assumptions behind scenarios and selecting them carefully. Then the second one is scenarios really weren't produced for investors. That's not what they were made for. And it's very difficult, as has already been mentioned, to pick out from these sort of huge reports, like the sort of, fantastic but quite daunting reports from the IPCC, and say, okay, what am I going to do with that in an investment context? And the institutions like the International Agency are trying to do better on that, and the IAGCC is engaging with bodies like that. But the report lays out some resources, this is kind of fuzzy again, but to say, how can you take those scenarios and tease out variables like GDP, as we've already heard, or at a more micro level, like trajectories to the sale of electric vehicles, those sort of future trajectories for different variables that can then lead to something you can actually plug into a DCF model or into your liability management. So the report has more detail on that, but that's a critical sort of translation that needs to take place. The core of the report is then about, well, how do you take that and apply it to investments? So once you know what you're trying to achieve, once you've got scenarios and kind of familiarize yourself with scenarios, what do you actually do? And here's where this sort of taxonomy idea comes in, that we've tried to classify and give case studies of different types of approaches in order to narrow the options and guide the choices available. And there's sort of three elements where we see this as being classified. So, as I mentioned right at the beginning, if you're taking this kind of alignment approach, I want to support a 2-degree future, that gives you a different set of options than if you're taking a financial risk perspective, where you might be looking at DCF modelling, value at risk, those kind of metrics. There's a sort of top-down and bottom-up approach, which is this kind of weird egg timer thing on the right-hand side, where you can look at climate risk from a very high level, looking at the sort of macroeconomic variables, or you can look at it at a very, very micro level, looking in real depth at an individual company and saying, okay, if I take a BHP Billiton or a BP, how exactly is the various revenue streams of that company going to be impacted? And then there are measures in the middle. So there are several methodologies, particularly those provided by some of the service providers, which look at a portfolio level. Let's take an equity portfolio and let's do some modelling, sort of matching the climate scenarios with some sector sort of data, and then let's match those together to see where the risks are. So again, none's right or wrong, but they're completely different and require very different approaches and different sets of data. And then, of course, there's transition risk and physical risk, which again we've touched on, two different sets of risk, but of course interlinked and interdependent, because the more we manage to transition, the less physical risk we will have. So the report goes through some examples, as I said, benefits, limitations, examples from working group members, examples from service providers. I think one of the key things is this balance of comprehensiveness and simplicity. And one of the big challenges for the investment world is, particularly when you get down past the sort of really mega big pension funds, this looks really difficult. And also it looks really complex, and it takes time to understand all those assumptions. So some of the members of the working group have sort of, rather than try to develop something which is very comprehensively mapping every type of risk, have taken more of a kind of proxy approach and said, well, let's just take a single variable. Let's just test this out. Let's try a carbon price approach. Let's apply a carbon price and see what impact that has on our investments. Some have taken a more qualitative approach and not even tried to model at all, as we've heard from some of the speakers before, and said, let's have a narrative. Let's have a couple of narratives. And that's the kind of thing that you can kind of get a grip on and discuss at board level. So again, neither's right or wrong. It is a complex issue. If you're going to try and model it properly, it is going to be very difficult. But that doesn't, there are different ways, there are ways to sort of bring it down to a simpler level that's then more understandable and more sort of, you can get a grip on. One thing also mentions is that you can't do one thing can't suit all. So perhaps a top-down approach can help you identify a heat map of risks, which can then help you sort of really pinpoint that bottom up, a few companies, a few assets, a particular asset class where you really want to do more of a deep dive. So combining approaches might be a sort of a practical and effective way to model risk. And then, again, reflecting some of what's already been said, what we don't want, and the thing we're really trying to avoid, is all of this happening and then it's sitting on a shelf. This has to be actionable. It has to be part of mainstream analysis, which is why we sort of stress throughout over and over, it's so important to go through that process of understanding how the methodologies work. any number that comes out of scenario analysis will be wrong. Without a doubt, it is not possible to model all the complexities of climate change. But these are some of the things we think are useful. So trends, drivers, order of magnitude, identifying hotspots of risk. These are all extremely useful outcomes from an asset owner point of view. And then in terms of the actions, again, not time to go into this in great detail here, but certainly for asset managers like ourselves, informing company engagement is important. I think one of the gaps at the moment, and some of these models that have been produced are incredible in the level of detail, but there is still lots of gaps in corporate disclosure. And if we're not getting the data from corporates in an accurate way, well, we can't model the risks. So a key part of this is to try and make the whole chain work better and inform our company engagement. And then the sort of bit at the bottom here is really important, and again reflects some of what's been said, is this sort of, we call it building memories of the future, thinking ahead about some of these risks and thinking how we will respond if certain events materialize. Thinking about how do we spot at an early stage the drivers of change, which way we're going and which scenario we're moving towards, and think through what actions we'll take depending on which way we're going, so that we are ready, we're primed, we're ready to act, and we spot the changes as they're happening, and we can act and react quickly. So I think that's the sort of main messages of the report. I think sort of a key message is, on top of all of that, is doing something is better than doing nothing. It's not to be daunted by the complexity. I think a lot of investors, institutional investors, asset owners and managers, really want to take this forward and are looking for ways to take action. And this is starting to create cultural change within the industry and create just a different way of thinking about investing. Practically speaking, we're taking this report out now mainly to IIGCC members, but also we're going on, we're going to do a series of events in European centres talking about some of the findings of this report, because as I said, what we found in producing it was that the dialogue that happened around it, having a sort of safe space to talk about some of the problems and the challenges that we've had, is incredibly valuable. So that's our main goal for 2019, is to take what we've got here. And we're very keen as well, of course, to work with other institutions, such as the Institute, such as the PRI, which is also doing good work in this area, to sort of work together as an industry to move this forward. So thank you very much. Very happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Vicky. That was really interesting. I don't want to eat too much into the time we have for the roundtable discussions, but do we have some immediate questions for Vicky at this point? Yep. So we have one over there. Thank you.
Thanks. Good evening, and thanks all for your discussions. I guess it's a kind of two-part question, one for Andrew, one for Vicky. But if we look at actuarial modelling thinking over the years, it sort of started off as deterministic and went into sensitivity testing, and then went into scenario testing as being a narrative around sensitivity, and then went into stochastic modelling for all sorts of good reasons. And Andrew, I think the stuff that you showed was you put the stochastic funnel of doubt, and those scenarios that you've done sort of seem to be narratives around some of the options that came out of that. Right, I mean, the stochastic run would have been 10,000 runs, but those scenarios could have just been a narrative of one of two of them. So that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question there for Vicky, though, is how much of the actuarial thinking, scenario testing, stochastic modeling, all that sort of stuff, you've been exposed to in your work, and what that brought to this work that you've done, that the sort of actuarial profession has contributed to your view of what's going on?
Do you want to take that piece first?
Shall I start? I think part of what this sort of whole thinking around scenario analysis has done is highlight the fact that ESG experts have been really bad at working with risk team experts. And part of what is valuable about this is that those teams are starting to work together in a way, frankly, they haven't done before. So some of what's in here and some of what the Bank of England's been putting out in its research is to say, well, we're not starting from scratch here. Scenario analysis is not a new idea. Let's take some of what's been learnt from other types of uncertainty analysis, scenario analysis, including what's being done in the actuarial world, and apply that to climate change. And let's not try and reinvent the wheel here. So, I think that's something that, as an industry, I think we talk a lot about mainstreaming ESG, and that means teams working with investment teams, but risk teams are quite new to some of these ideas. So I think that internal dialogue is something that, again and again, we kept coming back to in the working group, is that this is not something that can be pigeonholed as an ESG issue.
Yeah, thank you.
Is this on, or do I need?
Yeah.
I mean, say our scenarios, I mean, the deterministic scenarios were very much built around narratives. The stochastic element, I think, is too difficult at the moment. We were sort of overlaying it against the stochastic one just to see how the narratives compare to what you might be familiar with the stochastic model. I mean, ideally, you have a stochastic model which reflects climate change risk, but I think where we are at the moment, it's more about understanding rather than quantifying, and you get far more understanding out of a narrative in a deterministic scenario at the moment.
Okay, thank you. I think I should wrap up the discussion at this point, if I may, and then we'll see at the end if there's further sort of lessons from the general discussions. So thank you very much, Vicky. So far it's been the panel that's been doing all the work, and this is the point, obviously, at which we are looking to you to do some work and to contribute really to the thinking about what we should all be doing, both as individual actuaries and as the profession, in order to support climate change risk analysis in general. So I think the key objective is to set essentially the future path for the Working Party and for the IFOA. And one of the ways that we can perhaps most usefully do that is to think, as individual actuaries, what support would we like from the profession? But there are some specific questions which you've at least seen in outline in the original material about this event, and which we have now put on the tables, perhaps in a little bit more detail for you. There are 4 questions, and obviously we have around 40 minutes for this discussion. So I don't think I need to do the maths in terms of telling you how much time that gives for each question. But I will be, at intervals, just kind of reminding people that maybe if they haven't yet moved on to another question, it will be time to think about that. We'll have scribes at each table to sort of capture the key points of the discussion, which we'll be using going forwards. I should say at this point that this part of the proceedings is not going to be recorded, so this effectively is Chatham House. Remarks will not be attributed to individuals, but we do want to hear kind of what you've all got to say and what you're looking for. Some of the top table will be helping to facilitate the discussions. Others, like myself, will have the opportunity to move from one table to another just to kind of get a sense of what's going on in the discussion and just help us with the wrap-up at the end. Hopefully it's clear to you all what you need to be doing now. If not, let me just read out that first question to you, which says, starting point, you've heard a lot this evening, but what work are you aware of to allow for climate risks when setting long-term financial assumptions? Off you go, thank you. So I would just like to reflect a bit on what I've heard and then give the opportunity for others to do the same. So we're not going to ask for feedback from all the tables. We haven't got time for that. Just a reminder that obviously detailed notes have been taken and we will be playing back the summaries of those to you kind of in due course. But for me, there was certainly some very interesting conversation that was going on. Not all addressed specifically to the questions we asked, but that's fine. That's what one expects. In particular, I think some of the interesting conversation for me was around, okay, so we are focusing today on climate risk. It's an important risk and one that we should be thinking about. But is it really that different from some of the other risks that we are facing as a society and which potentially could impact on our work? So, for example, might the potential impact of artificial intelligence actually be just as big as what we're seeing from climate change? I don't think there's necessarily an answer to that. But it's interesting that, we, in one sense, we focus on one maybe more than on others. Just to reflect, that did remind me about a working party conversation that I was part of with the Cabinet Office, was having discussions around government about what are those big disruptors that could impact on things in the future. And it was very noticeable that the flavour of all those conversations, they'd asked from a wide variety of stakeholders, almost all would be an exaggeration, but the significant majority of the disruptors that people talked about were, if you like, downside or negative disruptors rather than positive ones. And in practice, clearly, there are all sorts of things that could have a big impact on the future, not all of which are negative. So is this that different? Should we be giving that much more attention to it? Some of the questions that we had, certainly as to this we're focusing on today. Another point that struck me as I went round was the thought that, is the reason we're struggling with this, we're finding it so difficult, that this actually is, in a sense, the most systemic risk that we've ever had to think about as a profession. And I guess that's something which probably resonates with me. Clearly, this could impact on everything. And that means that the scenarios that we look at, if we are looking at scenarios, should definitely cover demographic impacts as well as kind of the covenant impacts and financial impacts and the other things that we were, the insurance impacts, the other things that we talked about. Fair to say that I didn't actually hear that much from people saying actually what they were looking for next from the working parties and from the IFOA. So I would certainly be interested to hear back from any of the facilitators or others who are listening to different conversations about kind of that aspect in particular. Could we have a microphone down the front? Because I think Mike would like to comment on that one.
One of the most interesting bits of the conversation at our table, which I can claim I know very little about, because when somebody says ESG, I think environmental social governance, but of course everybody means economic scenario generators, was whether, and I don't know if this makes any sense at all, but whether one could begin to think of those in a climate scenario context, where one put an economic scenario generator with different climate, 1.5, 2, 3, 4. So I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but just as we were closing, we got to economic scenario generators and we're working out, does it make sense to consider those in climate scenario sense?
So effectively different calibrations that reflect the different scenarios we're thinking about.
Yes, and I can claim total ignorance of ESG things, so if this is a bad idea, I'll retreat quickly. But if it is any use, I don't know.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. James.
I think we were probably in the example you gave of not quite the discussion that was anticipated, but what came out from it was discussion about how existing businesses, and hence investments in those bonds, equities, how those might adapt to those systemic risks that you mentioned, and some of the comments around what could analysts and credit analysts be answering now from the point of view of that kind of assessment of potential environmental impact, and then a question around what's the fitness, the ability of the management to have strategic sort of foresight and have adaptive business plans, in particular for the kind of global businesses. Coca-Cola was mentioned, and there's other ones as well, and just saying, okay, what are those businesses doing to respond to the kind of changing demands, changing sort of recognition of externalities within the business. So I think there's a lot of work that investment analysts, perhaps we should be prompting them to be doing in the spirit of TCFD.
Yeah, and that prompts me then just to reflect back on another comment that I heard from more than one table, I think, which is effectively how much work others have already done potentially in this, which leads on to the question of, how efficient are markets, how much of the kind of risks that we're talking about are already priced in to some extent, and therefore what implications does that have? So a lot of challenging things, I think, for people to think about going forwards. Any final observations based on discussions at your table before I ask Claire to kind of just tell us about next steps?
There's one suggestion at our table right at the end, which I thought was very good, which is we need to help our fellow actuaries who aren't here tonight to understand this issue better, cut through the alphabet soup, and maybe we should try and tell some more stories about what firms have actually done and help people to understand the picture without having read a load of reports and gone through a lot of acronyms.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Okay, so Claire, perhaps if you could just remind people what we'll be doing with all the interesting comments we've had.
Well, I guess the first thing to say is thank you all very much for staying and contributing to the discussion. Could tell that all the tables were really engaged with the questions that we'd posed. There has been one person on each table taking notes so that we've got a good write-up and captured lots of the thoughts that have been shared tonight. The write-ups of the discussions will be shared among the 4 working parties so we can see the feedback that you've given, your suggested next steps. The working parties will be considering it themselves, and the Resource and Environment Research and CPD Committee will be considering the suggestions as well. Because we want to share the key messages with a wider audience, we'll also be doing a short summary of the main points that have been discussed. We're thinking in terms of a blog on the IFOA website in the next few weeks so that there's something out there on a timely basis. But then there'll also be a more formal write-up which will form part of the British Actuarial Journal article of tonight's event. Because normally there'd be a full Q&A that is subject to a transcript. Clearly that's not feasible with a round table format. So there will at least be a summary which goes in the British Actuarial Journal. In due course, we will, of course, let you know what the working parties decide in terms of taking forward the various suggested next steps. And I'm sure you'll see a lot of material coming out from the resource and environment practice area over the coming months and years as the profession develops its thinking on climate change.
So thank you very much, Claire. So it remains for me to express my own thanks. I should say thank you all for coming, for contributing to the discussion. It was good to hear so much volume of noise in the hall. And if you do want to continue that discussion, there are no formal refreshments afterwards, but I'm sure we can continue to use the council chamber or indeed any of the local hostelries that we pick on to continue the conversation. And do please engage with the work of the working parties going forwards. So finally, if I could just say a particular thanks to all those who have spoken this evening, the authors of the paper and the members of the working parties for organising this event, which has been so interesting. So thank you very much.